Hello, my name is Michael O'Donovan and this is the Grassland board at the Teagasc Moor Park Dairy Open Day, and the title of this board is the route to 15 tonne. This board has been shared by my colleague Mike Egan and Sarah Walsh, who are also part of the Grassland Science Department. So the key message from this board, and the key take-home message from this board, is that dairy farmers can increase grass dry matter production by an average 20% across the country. So how are they going to do this? And the ingredients and the route to doing this is within this board here today in the Moor Park Open Day. So if we look at, let's say, the grass dry matter production performance across a couple of sectors in the country, if you look at the National Farm Survey average, we're growing about 9.7 tonne of grass dry matter for the last 10 years. Compare that to the PBI average, which is growing about 13.2 tonne of grass dry matter. And then if you compare it to the top 100 farmers in pasture base, they're growing 15.2 tonne of grass dry matter. So what we're talking about today is very, very achievable by the dairy farmers across the country. And looking here at this graph here, which is basically the blueprint of growing this pasture dry matter across the season, what we expect as the target for grass production in spring is 2.6 tonne of grass dry matter, in the mid-season summer period about 6.7 tonne of grass dry matter, and in the autumn about 5.7 tonne of grass dry matter. And if you look here at the dotted line here, you can see the pasture-based grass demand. This is how much grass is required to feed the dairy cow and the dairy herd across the season. And you can see here the purple line is the 5-year average. And you can see here we're well off 15 tonne even with the pasture-based dry matter production average. So what are the key aspects of growing this grass dry matter across the season? And if we look at the dynamics of what's happening on farms across those three categories, we will learn a bit more from it. So we've broken the grassland management performance into different parameters. So you can see here the National Farms Survey average is 9.7 tonne, the pasture-based average is 13.2, and the top 100 dairy farmers in pasture base is 15.2 tonne. So what is the difference between these farms? In soil fertility, the National Farm Survey average is quite low in soil fertility, the PBI is medium, and the top 100 farmers in pasture base is high soil fertility. The grazing season length on average is about 55 days between the lowest, which is National Farm Survey farmers, compared to the PBI top 100 farmers. 235 versus 280 days, with the pasture based average farmers being about 265 days. When you look at grazing infrastructure, there's a difference here of 2 grazings here per hectare per farm per year. So 2 grazings, 6 versus 8, and in the middle it's about 7. The concentrate usage is about 13.5 tonne of concentrate dry matter per cow for the National Farm Survey, reducing for the pasture-based average farmers to about 1,100 kilos, and then reducing even further for the top 100 pasture-based farmers at 800 kilos. So you can see here a substantial half-tonne difference between the National Farm Survey and the top 100 farmers in pasture base. As we go into clover, and we've seen a lot of strides in clover input on farms, but again, many farms have no clover. National Farm Survey farms have less than 5% of their area in clover. The pasture-based average farmers, about 20% of the area in clover, and then the top 100 farmers in pasture base, about 35% of their area in clover, and growing every year. And clover is really important as a substitution for chemical nitrogen that we really do need. Area in oversowing, very much reflective of the area in clover, very low area of reseeding and oversowing taking place in National Farm Survey farms, about 5 to 10% on the pasture-based average farms, and then about 15 to 30% on the top 100 farmers in pasture base. Fertiliser usage, in fact there's only about 30 kilos of nitrogen usage here per hectare difference between the farmers, the National Farm Survey farmers, and the top 100 farmers in pasture base, and only about 10 kilos of a difference between the average pasture based farmer and the top 100 farmers in pasture base. And grass utilisation, the key driver of profitability, what you've heard from the first board and the second board, the key driver of profit is pasture utilisation. About 7.5 tonne for the National Farm Survey farmers, 10 tonne for the pasture based average farmers, and about 12 tonne for the top 100 farmers in pasture base. A substantial difference here. And you know, this grassland production difference leads to huge profitability differences on those farms. So what are the gaps that you can get, what can bridge the performance gap? And here today, you'll see it in the grass demos in the grass village, the clear guidance that we can go through for farmers to bridge this large gap in dry matter production. Correct pH above 6.5, we can grow about 1.5 tons more grass dry matter per hectare across the season. Also, I suppose a residual effect of this is there's better nitrogen utilisation when you have higher pH, and it's very easy to get clover into the sward when you have a high pH. Grazing management, achieving 8 grazing rotations across the season, we would lead to another 1.3 tonne of grass dry matter increase across the farm. Grazing management, getting the proper autumn closing cover and the spring opening cover on the farm. Another advantage of this, as well as providing more grass in the autumn and the spring to the farm, it leads to higher grass dry matter production across the season in those 2 periods, about 1 tonne more grass dry matter grown. And finally, the choice of high PPI and high clover performing varieties when you reseed and oversow can lead to about 1.5 to 2.5 tonne of grass dry matter. So on the second half of the board, I want to introduce my colleague Michael Egan, who's going to deal with the second half of the board now. Thank you.
Thanks, Mick. So my name is Mike and I'm going to cover the second half of this board, and really starting off as where Mick finished is grass white clover swards and what they can offer to our systems. And I suppose we've posed a couple of questions on where to start. Why really we want to look at white clover? We know we need to reduce chemical fertiliser use nationally, but in order to do that and maintain overall herbage production, we need legumes in the sward to bridge that gap through nitrogen fixation as a whole. What can it do and how much do we need? And they're probably the 2 questions that it really offers. We know that when we have sufficient levels of clover in the sward, we can increase animal performance by anywhere between 8 and 10%, or about 33 kilos of milk solids per cow per year. Additionally, this is coming from overall increases in sward quality, particularly increases in crude protein concentration and a reduction in overall NDF or fibre content. And that is leading to somewhere in the region of 1 to 1.5 increase in individual dry matter intake per cow per day. And I suppose what that is all giving us is that increase in overall milk production, or animal performance. I suppose the big benefit really coming back and in terms of what Michael was talking about in terms of overall herbage production is the nitrogen reduction usage that we can get, particularly in the middle of the year when we have high levels of clover content in the sward. And when we talk about how much clover we need, we're talking averaging 20 to 25% average sward clover content per year. And we know from research here that can give us between 70 and 100 kilos of nitrogen fixation per year. And that just allows us to reduce that level of chemical fertiliser by that amount. However, if we don't have that level of clover, we're not going to fix that same level of fixation, and if we take out that chemical fertiliser in the absence of it, it can lead to an overall reduction like what Michael was talking about on the National Farm Survey farms. And I suppose the key part of that when we have clover in the swards and ensuring we don't compromise overall production is managing or aligning clover content with chemical fertiliser through maximising overall fixation. And that is where we come up with this table here in terms of managing nitrogen input with clover in our swards. And while we're here, you'll see a lot of figures here, and each one of these figures in this part of the box is the level of chemical fertiliser that we need per month on a per hectare basis. And there's a variation depending on the level of clover content that we have in our swards when we start that kind of end of April, early May period. And that is when we make our decision based on the level of clover that we have in our sward. We know there's typically low levels of fixation early on in the year in spring, so we should not compromise or reduce overall chemical nitrogen fertiliser during that period here, and you'll see from this table here we have not. However, when we come into May, depending on the level of clover, that's when we can make significant reductions if we have sufficient clover content in our swards. And I'm not going to go through each one of these here, but if you just pick a sward that has 10% in April and follow that through, we know when we get to May we're going to get somewhere in the region of 10 to 15 kilos of nitrogen fixation per month from that clover in the sward, which allows us to reduce that chemical fertiliser by half for the remainder of the year, which will give us an overall production of about our application of 150 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And as we increase overall sward clover content really up into high levels, 20% in April, that's when we can reduce chemical or take out chemical fertiliser and replace it with soil or organic soil water or slurry during that mid-season period. And you'll see demonstrations of that as you go through the Grassland demonstration area next. I suppose if we look at what happens on this board and all the lessons that you've taken, what actions do we need to take now on your own farm? And we've broken them into 3 different categories. Short term, what needs to be done straight away as soon as you leave here today. And if you take anything from this board today, these really are the areas that we need to focus or concentrate on our farms. If we look at short term, Michael has talked about the large differences in soil fertility on National Farm Survey farms and the top performing farms on Pasture Base Ireland. So we need to spread lime, ensure that our soil fertility is optimal, index 3s and 4s for P and K, and our soil pH is 6.5. Farm cover targets, we have to follow them. We're not achieving our autumn targets or our overall spring rotation or spring opening farm cover targets either. In order to do that, we need to measure and manage grass, ensuring we achieve those targets to ensure we have enough grass on our farms to meet the animal requirements at all times. And then look how much clover we have in our swards and align our chemical fertiliser strategies. That's what can be done today, ensure we meet those targets in autumn and getting our soil fertility up to scratch. As we move towards medium long-term targets, aligning our stocking rates and our grass growth. And if your farm is consistently not achieving high grass growth levels and you're stocked too high, we need to ensure that our stocking rate is matched to our overall herbage production on our farm, that we're not relying on increase in supplementation as is happening on the National Farm Service with 1.3 tonne of concentrate coming in. And when we do that, we know we can reduce the level of concentrate that we're feeding to our cows. We have become an industry that is reliant on increasing concentrate usage to maintain overall production because we're not growing enough grass on our farms. We need to increase grass growth, align our stocking rate and reduce overall concentrate inputs. And then increase the level of clover that we have on our farms by first of all addressing soil fertility and then increasing clover by reseeding and oversowing as we go forward and putting a plan in place on that. And I suppose as we move towards longer term targets, make sure we're getting high animal performance from grazed grass and continue to increase that. Improve our grazing infrastructure so we can access and utilise all of that grass. As Michael said, it is the key driver in profitability on pasture-based farms. And then if we continue to get all of these targets in place, aim to grow between 13 and 15 tonne on a per hectare per year on our individual farms to ensure that we can maximise overall production from that. Take home messages, and the first thing Michael said on this board is there is capacity to grow 20% more grass on individual farms, and the key messages here that we've gone through will show or should increase how we can do that. First, the question we need to ask is why and where is our farm not growing? Identify those paddocks and areas on our farm and try and put some of those actions into place that we can ensure that we correct those deficiencies that are there. There has to be an environmental focus, but we cannot compromise herbage production in the absence of chemical fertiliser when we don't have clover. So ensure that our clover and our nitrogen are aligned, that we're getting the maximisation of both. And growing 15 tonne is not easy. If it was, everyone would be doing it. But we need to have all of these actions in place to ensure that we consistently do that.